Please put your hands together and give a big, warm Edinburgh welcome to Andy Thomas. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate that. And yes, we've heard there from Richard an introduction pretty much to what I'm going to do this evening. Those of you that know anything about me will know that I have had a history of investigating many things where you're trying to get to the truth of something. And as you've just heard there, I began by investigating what some people would call the paranormal. That can cover all kinds of things, and you can have many different views about what the paranormal is. But that has led me to realize that so many things are misrepresented. And we are not told the truth about the basics of anything. And something as seemingly trivial and silly as, say, crop circles, which I'm not going to be talking about tonight, which are ridiculed widely, treated as a big joke. When you actually start to look at the evidence, you realize that even the basics of them are misrepresented. I can't tell you where they come from. I can say that some are man-made. I can say that I do not believe that they are all man-made, and therefore what is going on there is another matter. And you can pick virtually any subject that does not fit into the mainstream box that they like it to fit into and find that it is willfully misrepresented. So if something as basic as a pretty pattern in a field is being misrepresented, well, what else is being misrepresented? And the answer is literally everything. Now, those of you that saw me speak at the Awaken State Conference a year or so back will know that I spoke about the history of conspiracy theory, which is indeed what I will be doing at Glasgow tomorrow. I'm not going to go into the background to all that again today, although we will touch on a few aspects of it, because I want to focus on what's happening now and try to see that there is a wider pattern to the events which we are being dealt with, or are dealing with, I should say now, which are not declared, which are not being fully understood. And I'm going to try to get to what the threads are that pull many of these things together to see if we can get to a greater understanding of what the global agenda is, and therefore how do we transform it? How can we change the way things are going if we don't like what we see? And if we're never told the truth in the mainstream, how do we literally transform the way we move forward? So that's what we're going to do this evening. So we're going to do it in two halves. As you've heard, short break, and then we'll come back for the rest of the talk, and then hopefully later some discussion. I'm going to start, though, by just looking briefly at something reasonably esoteric and yet not, and then we're going to get very real world. So, you may or may not remember that in the year 2012, there was a lot of hoo-ha that it might be the end of the world on 21st of December 2012. I don't personally know anybody that really thought it was going to be the end of the world. I worked closely, for instance, with Jeff Stray on his book Beyond 2012, and he basically was open to all kinds of areas that these ancient prophecies that were being spoken of in the run-up to that, what they might have been about. And I just want to say this now, that of course, when it wasn't the end of the world in 2012, there was instant ridicule, there was the usual mainstream, basically scoffing, and we expected that. But that was only because they didn't really understand what it was all about, and it never was about the end of the world. I'm not going to go into a history here of why people think we have now entered a new era of consciousness, but I do want to just show you that maybe there is a process that could actually lead, whether anybody likes it or not, to a whole new way of approaching the world. So there are many ancient prophecies. We've all heard probably about the Mayan prophecies, but they were just one ancient culture that had beliefs about these times that we are now in, which said that there would be a shift, there would be a change, there would be a transformation. And when you look around the world, you've got Maori prophecies, you've got Zulu prophecies, you've got, any culture you care to mention, the Chinese, the I Ching, factors into this calendrical cycle, which, cutting a long story short, is 5,125 years. And the belief was that when this cycle ended and began again, as it did on 21st of December 2012, in our calendrical reckoning, that's when this shift occurred. the belief was there would be a huge and rapid change. And indeed, if you look at what's happened since the end of 2012, well, many people think that, in fact, is precisely what has occurred. Why might this occur? Because it's all very easy to talk about esoteric prophecies and then not give any reasoning for why it might be a shift of the age. Well, I'm going to pluck out one possibility. There's been a number of possibilities put forward, but I think one of the most believable, most credible, based on evidence, comes from the work of Dr. Paul Laviolette, and other researchers have picked up on his work. Paul Laviolette is a man that I have met, and he's a very interesting person. He is an astrophysicist and was not at first remotely interested in anything strange, but he became aware through his studies of the ice core samples at the poles, which of course record very much climate change, cosmic dust entry into the atmosphere. It's all there in the ice cores. He realized there was a repeating pattern, and he began to realize that cosmic dust was being brought into the Earth's atmosphere at regular intervals. And there were some big pulses of this, and then some small ones, and then some medium ones. And he realized very quickly that these ice core sample layers correlated with the ancient cycle, the 5,125-year cycle, and he was astonished. And he thus has formulated the theory of galactic superwaves. There is an idea which is based not just on hearsay, but by looking at what's going on with other galaxies, that every now and then you seem to get a pulse of electromagnetic energy, for want of a better word, a charged region of space that passes from the center of the galaxy outwards. We don't quite know what's there. Is it a supermassive black hole, as many people believe? Is there some other energy source there? But they seem to pulse. So he believes, and other people believe the same thing, that there is a regular pulsing, and that this wave, as it passes through the galaxy, will of course have an effect on the stars and the planets that it goes through. It can take possibly thousands of years to pass through one of these bands. Now, the good news is that according to the ice core samples, the current wave that we're going into, therefore, is not a major one, but neither is it a minor one. It's in the middle. And he believes that this is the cycle that the ancients were recording, and that therefore, if he's right, we should be able to see some symptoms of the changes that you would expect if one of these waves was passing through. And when you start to look at what's going on in our solar system, you realize, yes, we are seeing exactly the kind of evidence that we would imagine. We've got, across the board, rising temperatures. You talk about global warming, and we will in the second half, by the way. There is a warming process, but it's got nothing to do with us. It seems to be passing through the whole solar system. Many planets seem to be warming up. For instance, the ice caps on Mars are melting. That's nothing to do with us. Or is it? But in another way, maybe it is. We have fluctuating brightness, changes in magnetic densities and atmospheric densities, I should say, and magnetic fields. We even have new atmospheres, very thin, but nonetheless verifiable, on Mercury and the Moon. So we've got shifts, we've got changes going on that suggest something has happened. Everything is in motion. Not only have you got the waves passing through, but our solar system, is of course in motion. And as we move through different regions of space, we could quite reasonably expect different effects. And so, therefore, you should be able to look at the Earth and you should be able to see that there are certain things which occur here, which, of course, will affect not only the climate, but the people living on it, and therefore, presumably, the whole consciousness of a species. The main method by which this works, according to many of the people that have researched the ancient time cycle, is probably the behavior of the sun. And Laviolette says, well, basically, as the electromagnetic wave passes through, the first thing you will see is the sun begin to respond in unusual ways. Well, over the last 25 years, we have had records broken of solar flares, coronal mass ejections, sunspot activity. We've seen time and again it doing things we didn't know it could do. It's produced the biggest flares that we didn't even know it could do. There is a scale of solar flares which used to go up to X20. They thought that was the most powerful it could be. And it's exponential. It's like an earthquake chart. Well, in 2003, they had a flare that was an X45, which they didn't even realize could exist. So we are dealing with the sun doing things we didn't know it could do. The danger of that is, in the worst case scenario, of course, it could very powerfully affect our electrical grids. NASA has put out some very, vocal warnings that we need to beware. In the last couple of years, the sun's gone quiet, and it suddenly looks like it's entering a calmer period. Now, that's not necessarily good news, because it could be the calm before the storm, because you can still have enormous flares erupt. There was the Carrington event of 1859, where there was a huge flare. There wasn't much in the way of electrical equipment back then, a few telegraph systems. It played havoc with them. If that had happened today, we would have all been in trouble, because our entire infrastructure would have shut down. So we need to be careful, because if the sun does produce a flare pointing in the wrong direction, we're going to have to be ready, or civilization is suddenly going to grind to a halt for a while. But that's the negative side of it. There's very potentially a very positive side of it, which is this affects us. There are now astrophysicists and researchers out there who believe that it's this cycle of the solar cycle, which may in itself then be in turn affected by the galactic superwaves, that is changing us, that produces leaps forward in evolution. And when you start to look at the effect that increased electromagnetic energy has on us, and in particular the pineal gland, maybe it starts to reveal things we need to be aware of. I'll come to that in a second, because there's another thing that could affect us in this way. Our planet is inextricably linked up, of course, with our star, our magnetic fields. A lot of people think we're in the early stages of what's called geomagnetic reversal, which is where the Earth's magnetic field will reverse. There's various old prophecies about an axis tilt to the planet. Now, that's not what we're dealing with necessarily here, but we know the Earth has had completely different magnetic polarities in the past. Through geological research, we know this to be true. Many people think we're seeing the beginning of a change now. For instance, magnetic north is 100 miles or so away from where it was just a century or so ago. It's travelling fast now. It's on the move more quickly than we've known. That suggests there's something going on inside the planet which is being affected by wider cycles. So some scientists say this would take thousands of years to happen. You don't need to worry. Others, though, are saying no. That final flip of the Earth's magnetic fields could in fact take place literally within a matter of days. And by the way, I should say this isn't just fringe scientists saying this. There's even been Horizon programs about this. This is what would happen. So there we are. That's basically how things normally are. And then it would begin to scramble. All the normal polarities and all the usual magnetic fields that we have would begin basically to get tangled up and start to unravel. That's going to have a number of dramatic effects that a lot of people think we're already seeing the early stages of. The Earth's magnetic field is at the lowest in recorded history, for instance. We're getting a lot of animals going missing, getting lost. Whales, dolphins, beaching, which may be partly to do with the microwave transmissions we're putting out there, but may also be to do with the fact that the systems by which they navigate are shifting, are changing. So it may be there will come a time, and it may be hundreds of years, maybe even another 1,000, but it could be next week. We don't know. Maybe we're going to suddenly get an influx, a lot more of this electromagnetic energy, because while this happens, we will not be protected by the usual fields that we're protected by. Now, that may be the very thing that suddenly affects us and causes some leap in evolution, as I will explain in a moment. It would certainly give us some lovely displays of the aurora, but then you wouldn't necessarily want to be standing in your garden looking at it, because you're not going to be very protected for a few days. So some say this has happened before, that it happens on a regular basis, and some are saying this is partly to do with the cycle that perhaps the ancients were recording. Now, there is serious research to say this would affect us, it would affect our behaviour, it would affect the consciousness of beings on the planet. You will have heard, I'm sure, of dimethyltryptamine if you know anything about the ayahuasca plant, for instance, which is something now a lot of people are exploring, changing their consciousness through substances that the shamanic peoples have used for centuries. It's a very good book by Rick Strassman, who has explored the effect of dimethyltryptamine on the brain. But more than that, identifying that we naturally produce it. Let's call it DMT for short. We produce it at birth, we produce it as we go into the death stage, but we also produce it at times of trauma, like in a car accident. People often say it was weird, everything went into slow time. Well, one theory is what's happening is your pineal gland is suddenly producing more DMT to sort of take you away from the experience so you can cope with the trauma in that moment. And this seems to be like a sudden triggering of DMT. But the other thing that triggers DMT is exposure to electromagnetic fields. With experiments, when you expose a human being to more of these fields, we start to produce more DMT. Our consciousness begins to shift. And you can do that, of course, by triggering it out in the jungle or wherever you are with ayahuasca or Syrian rue is another plant that can give you this experience. And this is how people say they're expanding their consciousness. But it may be that increased pulse waves coming from the sun and from wider cosmic cycles may well be doing this to all of us anyway. There's another researcher whose work I would recommend finding out about, and that is Dr. Michael Persinger. And he's realized that at times of very high solar activity, Richard mentioned ghosts earlier on. You get more ghost activity. You get more out-of-body experiences, more overt sort of strange psychic phenomena. At low periods of solar activity, you seem to get more gentle, sort of a collective psychic field. It's not quite so overtly dramatic, but there are definite correlations. And again, exposing the human brain to electromagnetic effects can open you up to experiences. People who've had electromagnetic waves into their brain suddenly have started seeing ghosts and figures coming through walls, and as if they're breaking through dimensions. You'll often hear people say these days, the veil is thin, there is a lifting of the veil between worlds. And maybe there is a truth to that. So it could be we're heading for a time where, who knows, if we get a huge pulse, we could all suddenly experience a mass out-of-body experience or a huge mass collective hallucinogenic experience, which might be marvelous, but probably not if you're driving. But that's another story. Now, some say this is nonsense. It's never going to happen that quickly, but maybe it's happening gradually. Maybe it'll be both. It'll build up slowly, and then this could happen. But some say we're already in this period. This was what the ancients were proposing. They didn't know, of course, the mechanism, but they knew there was a cycle. Now, I can't prove to you that any of this is true, but I can say that I believe when you look around the world today, you can see clear evidence of a shift. I think there is a consciousness shift going on. We're seeing people challenge things they've not challenged before, and there is a much greater global awareness of issues that previously were either hidden or we just didn't deal with. There is a move forward here, and this is partly what we're going to deal with today. I'm not going to go very much into the spiritual realms, but I should just say that, some people in the more New Age realms have spoken of what they call ascension. And some people were hoping, indeed, on 21st of December 2012, they might suddenly be lifted up into a higher dimensional state. Well, I don't know, that always seemed a bit too easy to me. That's a bit of a free lunch, isn't it? Why do any work when all you have to do is sit back and suddenly you'll be enlightened? I don't think that's the way it's going to work. We have to work for enlightenment. You actually have to put things right. Something doesn't just come and put it right for you. And some people say ascension is really essentially the New Age version of the rapture. This belief that many evangelicals have that we will suddenly be bodily lifted up into heaven. Now, I'm not saying that either belief is wrong, but, again, that seems too easy to me. The notion you don't have to do anything. Just wait and you'll be enlightened. I don't think it's going to be that easy, but I do think we now have tools with which to do more than we were able to today. And if there's any truth to what we've just said there, and I believe the evidence is strong personally that there is, then we are beginning to have faculties that are going to help us move forward. But we still have to deal with the real world. Okay, so now I'm going to change the tone of this, because you can't just say, I'm enlightened now, I don't need to do anything practical. Well, what the hell does that mean? Yes, you do. There is a belief that maybe part of the recent rise in control agendas around the world is because those in power And it's very plain they have distinct occult beliefs. If you know anything about the Bohemian Club or, various occult connections that some people seem to have in high levels of power, for which see some of my other talks, you will know that they would be more than aware of predictions of consciousness shift. That's the bloody last thing they want. If they even suspected something might come in that might make us all suddenly massively aware, they're going to feel very threatened by that. A lot of people think that is precisely what's going on. Hence the acceleration we've seen in recent times of control, surveillance, and a manipulation of global events to make sure that we're all kept under the thumb. Now, even if that's not the case, you're still dealing with the same thing. There is definitely an acceleration in the control agenda. Conspiracy theory is a very crude term to describe something that is, I think, of great validity and much wider than that. But I won't necessarily resist the term conspiracy theory. To a degree, that's the reality. When you're not quite sure of the truth, you're theorizing about something that might be a conspiracy. Well, what's wrong with that? The general view of many people at the moment is that there is a mass manipulation to create the new world order. I'll talk about that briefly in a minute, just give you a little snippet of its background, because when you hear people discuss the new world order in conspiracy terms, that is not a modern invention, it is a real living project. And I will show you the evidence for that in a moment. The general idea seems to be to gather much of the world into basically a series of superstates where very few hands have an awful lot of power, the one world government. And some see things like the EU project, for instance, as a step towards that. But even if you don't agree with that, there's no question that more and more power is going into hands which often are simply not declared. And that's when you have to find out about the Bilderbergs and the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations and so on and so on and so on, which I will be discussing more tomorrow evening in Glasgow. The point I want to make here, though, is that there is certainly no reason to trust those in power. The general view is that wars are manipulated, recessions are manipulated, the economy is manipulated all the time. We are lied to on a regular basis, on a very wide basis. The media is the mouthpiece by which those lies very often are propagated. They are part of the establishment for the most part, with a few happy exceptions, but mostly it's two sides of the same coin. And we'll say a little bit more about that later on. What we can say, though, is that it's very hard to find anybody that entirely trusts what their governments say to them, which fits perfectly with one of the ancient prophecies. Briefly, the Jaguar priests, they were the Mayan priests, really, and very late in the Mayan civilization, really it was nearly over for it, they finally wrote down what had previously been word-of-mouth stuff. And this is where we hear much about the Mayan prophecies, is in fact from the books of the Jaguar priests. And there's one particular prophecy that I'll just read to you, which is supposed to describe the very times we now find ourselves in. It says, "For those Katoons, period of time, there shall be no priests, and no one who believes in his government without having doubts. I recount to you the words of the true gods when they shall come." Now, I don't think anybody's really going to argue with the fact there's not many people around these days who does believe in their government without having doubts. And certainly in the West, there's, spiritual figures, finding people that everybody trusts in and relies on. Yeah, that's something I think is on shaky ground at the moment. The true God's coming? Well, who knows? Some of the prophecies spoke of the descent of the 9 support gods. You can look at that another way. Maybe the gods aren't coming, but maybe consciousness, something, some new consciousness descending on us or being born from us. Well, maybe that's exactly what's going on. So let's look at the reality of what we're dealing with here. I think when you look around you, just at the last couple of years, again and again, you can see revelation after revelation of things that were previously hidden. And this is mainstream. Much of it had been spoken of in the world of conspiracy theory for years, but this is now mainstream. The Hillsborough cover-up. For years, people have said the police have lied about this. Now we know that's true. Jimmy Savile. Conspiracy websites had named him as a paedophile 15 years ago. Now we know it's true. The Rebecca Brooks, the Rupert Murdoch cover-up, the fact that Murdoch was effectively ruling us by proxy, and probably still is somewhere down the line now, but not so overtly. This has all come out in recent years. They've tried desperately to brush it under the carpet. The bank scandal, the bank's crash, the fact that nobody's tried to then really deal with that. That's something we'll come back to later on. And more recently, we had this revelation from Edward Snowden. Now, some people don't even trust Snowden himself. They think there could be something, manipulative about that. But there's no question he has revealed things we did not know before. Or did we? I mean, one of the things we found out about is through things like the PRISM network, literally everyone and everything is under surveillance. There is no question about it. Now, this is not a surprise to many people who've been in the truth-seeking world. And yet now there is an acknowledgement this is true. It doesn't mean they've got the money or the time to be checking every single person's emails and phone, but they could if they wanted, and they clearly monitor. It would not be a big deal for them to do it. So yes, we are under mass surveillance. Yes, the Orwellian state is here. There is no question. And of course now through social network, and we all happily give away everything about our lives anyway. But it goes a stage further. So we've seen absolute proof in recent times that we are being manipulated, we're being observed, we are being controlled. The fact that it's seeped through the mainstream as much as it has tells you that if that's just what's on the surface, you can begin to imagine what is going on down below. So we're dealing with times where everything's up for grabs, but we're also dealing with times where people are responding differently. And one thing that I think that the powers that be hadn't anticipated is that actually, finally, we're getting longer memories. Syria is something we'll mention in a moment. But you'll remember a year or so back, there was the whole scandal over the chemical weapons, which seems to be awakening again at the moment. A lot of feeling that there was manipulation going on here. We weren't being told the truth of that situation. But that aside, it was clear the war drums were being beaten. Here we go, back again. It felt like the beginning of the Iraq War, trying to get the public to support military action in Syria. Now, some say we should do something. But the problem is, what do you do? What's the correct action to take? And it was clear they were going to do the usual thing of going in bombing in the name of that rebel group or that rebel group indiscriminately. Who the hell was that really going to help? And the public said no. Everybody remembered the whole weapons of mass destruction debacle, David Kelly and all of that, and they just said, no, we're not going for this. And I think that was a surprise to some of the people who were pushing for this. I don't think they had expected such resistance. Now, whether it was the dawning of a new consciousness or whether it was purely the fact they realised they were going to lose voters at the next election, I'm not sure. But maybe it's both. And they withheld that action. They didn't. They didn't do it. And I think some years previously they would have done. And I think that's a sign that finally what people think is beginning to matter. They can go so far, they can ignore us so far, but then there comes a point where it's not in their interest to do that. And I think that was a sign that something is shifting and that finally there is a collective consciousness that is having more of its way. But that doesn't mean we're not being manipulated. And indeed, the whole Syria situation is a terrible series of events, as you don't need me to tell you, but the sadder thing is it's pretty clear when you look at the origins of it that Western manipulation helped kick it off. There's been claim after claim that the initial rebellion was basically caused by agent provocateurs with Western influence. And I'm going to give you two examples of how it would seem pretty clear that that is true from even mainstream sources. This isn't conspiracy stuff, this is stuff in the mainstream. And one thing that came out was a rather interesting quote from this gentleman here. This is Roland Dumas, who was the French foreign minister for some years. And just when the whole Syria war began to kick off a year or two back, he was doing an interview and he came out with a quite extraordinary claim. And in the interview, he basically said, well, yeah, I think, we've got something to do with this. And here's an exact claim that he said. He said, I was in Britain 2 years ago and I met British officials, some of my friends. They admitted that they were up to something in Syria. And he was saying that basically, the intelligence services were there trying to disrupt things. So now that was a very big admission. Note that he's gone very quiet about this since. I think somebody probably rapped his knuckles. But what about another source? Well, I mean, you'd like to hope, wouldn't you, Catholic nuns wouldn't make stuff up. Whatever you think of their beliefs, they clearly believe what they believe. And so you hope you're going to get the truth. Mother Agnes is a Catholic nun in Syria, and she's been very vocal in trying to show people what's really going on there. And she has said time and time again, this is being manipulated by outside forces. And here's just one quote from her, which is worth reading. She said, "The war which affects my country today is a war between Syrian civil society on the one hand and Islamic terrorist groups on the other. These terrorists are supported by foreigners from various countries and funded by various countries, especially Saudi Arabia." Now, you may note, if you look at the fine details, Saudi is something that comes up time and again as being a country that's behind a lot of terrorist stuff, and yet that's very rarely reported in the mainstream. Almost certainly because the West has so many dealings with Saudi Arabia, they daren't expose it. We've got so much money tied up with oil and the whole situation in the Middle East. But basically what she's saying is there are many foreign countries who are using Syria as a playground, a theatre of war, for reasons of their own, to destabilise that region. And many other people have voiced exactly the same belief. And when nuns start to say this, you have to say, okay, maybe there is a truth to this, and we need to be very careful because we are certainly not told the whole truth of what is going on there by the media, that is for certain. And that, of course, then begins to throw a light on the situation going on in Ukraine. So Ukraine, of course, has had a similar situation, although it hasn't quite gone to the Syrian levels yet. We hope, of course, that it won't. But again, you've got the same accusations very early on that Western intelligence agencies helped to trigger off the unrest. Now, in that, Putin may be right, because Russia has said this very loudly. Actually, the evidence does support that. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we can entirely rely on Putin. We'll come to him in a moment. The big turning point in the Ukrainian crisis, rebellion, whatever, was when people started to get shot dead on the streets. That was a big deal for obvious reasons. But one of the things was that it was apparently the government that shot the people. But Channel 4 News, only about a month ago, 2 months ago, live on air, managed to say that there was a leaked email. Matt Fry was a reporter. A leaked email had come out which had said, in fact, or confirmed, that it was the rebels who fired on themselves. Classic false flag tactic to make it look like the government had done it. Now, this actually went out on live Channel 4 News. And I said to my wife, Helen, at the time, I bet we never hear anything else about this. And sure enough, there's been a complete blanket of silence about that ever since. That's never been looked at, never picked up again, even by Channel 4 News. And yet people on the ground there have said much the same thing. Now, that's not to say all the same people were shot by the same people, but I get the horrible feeling there is a lot of subterfuge going on, and Asian provocateurs are being used to destabilise this region. Now, might it be that there is another agenda going on here that is not being declared? Well, it's quite possible, isn't it? Crimea has often been a flashpoint in human history. This is not the first time we've had very dangerous things occurring in Crimea. There is, of course, the famous Crimean War in the Victorian days. But what about another event? Let's just briefly go back in time. I'm not going to go much into this, but we need to say something about this. At the end of World War II, which in itself many people say was manipulated, but that's another story, we had this meeting at Yalta in the Crimea in 1945, and some people see this as a key stage in the New World Order project, basically taking a new form, where we have Churchill, Roosevelt in the middle, and of course Stalin, who at this point were allies, and yet this really was the moment where Stalin was set up as the big enemy. Stalin was not a nice man, and no one's going to make any excuses for him, but I think he was cornered into really playing a role. And he played it very well. And this was then the beginning of the Russian bear, the Soviet Union, the Cold War, the threat, constantly. I'm sure many of us here grew up with the thought we could be incinerated by a nuclear blast at any moment. What a thing to do to the collective consciousness. Certainly I grew up with that expectation. We were probably all going to get blown up. Cold War was very good for creating fear and thus for creating very good avenues of control. If you've read your George Orwell, and if you haven't, do read 1984, you will know you need to have an enemy. You must have an enemy to kick against, to justify all kinds of economic things, arms manufacturing, keep you powerful. You've got to have someone to kick against. And of course, Stalin played that role very, very well. So some say this was part of a wider plot, a very brief point about the New World Order. So in case you're thinking, well, that's just something conspiracy theorists say. No, it isn't. If you go back to 1909, you get a key moment where Arthur Balfour, who would become the Prime Minister of Britain, wrote to the then President, another Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, who was President of the United States, and basically said, in no uncertain terms, listen, we all know Britain and America are the best. We're better than anybody else. We should run the world. And there's a researcher called Terry Boardman who's written a very good book about the origins of the New World Order. I'll quote him because he says it the best. He says that what Balfour proposed was a global Anglo-Saxon confederation that would police the world with the navies of the two countries and through their invincible domination bring eternal peace and prosperity. So this was a very serious proposition, and many people think it was basically acted on and began the run-up to the control agenda that we see gripping the world today. And just the term New World Order, this is not something superimposed. It was used widely by supporters of this project. H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, philosophers, writers, thinkers of the day, openly advocated the New World Order. And indeed, H.G. Wells even wrote a non-fiction book about the New World Order, saying, very good thing, we should definitely go for it. And then advocating in the same breath things like eugenics, which Russell did as well. And this was seen as perfectly acceptable in these terms and in those days. So when you then look at the amount of speeches where people like Obama has boasted of creating New World Order, Gordon Brown was one of the best ones. There's one famous speech where he says New World Order something like 20 times in one speech. This is not some fiction. There is certainly a plan to run the world for the needs of the few at the expense of the many. So, the fact that stuff's kicking off today in Crimea, for many people has a funny echo. They think, okay, they love symbolism. The people that run the world love it, and the fact that stuff's going on there today makes you wonder what's occurring now, because here we are years later, and the faces have changed, but maybe the basic idea hasn't. Putin has certainly been set up as the new big enemy. We needed another one, because Al-Qaeda had been the enemy, bin Laden for a while, but that then all fell apart, of course, as soon as they claimed that they shot him dead in his underpants, which is a whole other story, which many people don't believe that it was him, but that's for another time. Al-Qaeda really ran the course. It was starting to get too difficult with that. We need an enemy back. Hey, Russia will do it, won't they? They're always very good for this sort of thing. If you look at how the West has been disadvantaging Russia over the last sort of 15 years or so, you can see they've been pushed into a situation where they feel weak, where they did not feel they had the correct presence on the world stage that maybe they felt they deserved. And Putin, ex-KGB, lest we forget, this is a man for whom Soviet ideals are still alive and well. He is much looked up to in Russia. He is a very popular leader. And Putin basically is happy to play the role. He is more than happy to say, I'm going to put Russia back on the map. And so the current situation, in a way, is suiting him very well. But there's a strange message underlying all of this. Have you noticed how, we're all saying Putin, he could be the big threat. There's people now in Ukraine saying he wants to start World War III. I don't think he does personally, but he certainly would like you to think that, because then that makes him look big and powerful. But here's the thing. At the same time as being trained to sort of fear him, we're also being trained to admire him. In fact, Nigel Farage recently said, didn't he, I admire Putin, which of course caused then a bit of a fuss. But if you look at how Putin has been shown to us in the media, there's been a lot of shots of him in the gung-ho sort of method, hasn't there? He does all this kind of shooting and fishing and hunting and doing really gung-ho things, getting on submarines. And it's great, and the cameras love it, and he loves to play up to it and get the shirt off, and there he is. But that's a curious thing, because it's almost like he's being built up as someone, you might fear, but you also kind of look up to him as well. By contrast, look at how Obama has been increasingly portrayed. Here's just a couple of shots that have been in the media recently. Obama with a fly that landed on his head in the middle of a speech, and, caught on a bit of an off-guard moment. An old picture from years ago, suddenly back into the mainstream. He's portrayed as weak. So on one level, we're being sort of built to fear the Russians again because we need, it would seem, the old situation to manipulate what's going on. But at the same time, Obama is not being portrayed to us as anybody who's actually capable of fighting that. The fear there is that what that's going to lead to at the next US election is the election of somebody far more right-wing, far more militaristic. And then, of course, you're getting into more serious flashpoint situations where you might see something kick off in the Middle East or in the Ukraine. So it's worth thinking about the way people are portrayed because it feels at the moment incredibly manipulative. Let us not forget, war is business. Big business, the biggest business. Indeed, even if we didn't have arms manufacturing, our British economy would collapse. It'd fall apart. We need it. We live off the benefits of misery. Sad, isn't it? But we do. And to get off that is going to be a long and arduous process. But at the moment, we are so inextricably linked up with money from war that I don't think anybody quite realizes just how much it has infiltrated the entire way the economy runs. And it's really worth listening to the words of some of our MPs. Sir Malcolm Rifkind, he's a person who pops up every now and then. And he kind of has a sort of an avuncular style, but you'll notice, he's very pro-war. He always thinks definitely bomb Syria, definitely we should be going in and sort of fighting Putin off and all of this. And he's entitled to his opinions. And there's other MPs who say the same things. But then look at who they're working for. So Malcolm Rifkind works for several of the biggest arms companies in the world. Of course he wants to go to war, or at least to create the fear of war, so you have to have the arms manufactured, because he's going to benefit hugely from it. So always ask that classic conspiracy question, who benefits? And indeed, that then begins to answer many questions, and money, I'm afraid, is a big part of this. We know there are many issues with banks. Some people have tried to expose the way the world works. Poor old Bradley Manning up there. Bradley Manning's now in prison probably forever for trying to show the world what was going on, as opposed to the bankers who managed to nearly demolish the economy just a few years back, who've been rewarded. I don't think anyone's gone to prison. There's been one or two people with slapped wrists. They haven't been touched at all. The world of banking has not been changed. No government will dare legislate against the banks because it's the banks that carry the power. This is the classic sort of conspiracy view of banking. And maybe this is a bit over the top, but nonetheless, there is certainly a reasonable ground to say the people with the money are calling the shots. And those in the glass towers, of course, do not carry the responsibility they should do. They run it all, essentially. And yet they get off scot-free time and time again. So no government will touch them. They make tiny little changes to legislation around the edges. They're still living the bonus culture to the fullest. It's often said that the people in these glass towers could put the world's problems to rights tomorrow. No poverty, no poor people, nobody starving. They could do it tomorrow. They've got so much money. But they choose not to. And we go with this. We tacitly go with this. No one's there rioting at the bottom of Canary Wharf Tower. Why? And indeed, in fact, the gulf between the haves and the have-nots is worse now than it's been in many years. It's always been there throughout human history. It's a sad fact. But it's particularly savage at the moment, that divide, and it's getting worse. And here's the genius, the absolute genius of one of the agendas that's being run at the moment, is we've been cleverly fooled into blaming those at the bottom of the ladder for all the world's woes. Have you noticed, particularly if you're a Daily Mail reader, who's to blame for Britain's troubles? The benefits cheats, the scroungers, the single mothers. These poor sods at the bottom are taking the rap. And we've been therefore very cleverly deflected away from actually holding to account the ones with the money that could change everything tomorrow. Yes, some people abuse the benefit system. How many of them? So small it makes zero difference to the economy. But our collective consciousness has been misled into thinking it's their fault. And we should be very, very, I think, aware of what we're doing before we start demolishing a welfare state. that in fact has been incredibly beneficial and rightly so to many people. But we're being encouraged to give our consent to demolish it while the people in the towers get richer and richer and richer. And one way we've really seen this illustrated is, for instance, the business of gas prices. Okay? This is not a small thing. There are people dying in Britain today because they dare not put the heating on when it's cold. Is this a sensible state of affairs? But we've all been fooled into thinking it's all right. The gas executives say, it has to be like this. You have to pay me this bonus because we couldn't operate in a proper market if we didn't do this. And all this nonsense which we swallow. Otherwise, why aren't we rioting outside the gas offices? So we're going with this. We might grumble, but that's a different thing. So, we're cleverly fooled into a situation where we're worried about even putting the heating on. But then you begin to see another wider agenda coming in. It's going to take me on now to the next stage, and that is this. With the situation in Russia getting worse and worse, it would seem, and Crimea and Ukraine, have you noticed how there's a certain rhetoric started to creep in that begins to give away the game? What about this character here? William Hague was the first to really state it, and he wasn't the only one. But he said the magic words, and I was sort of getting ready to hear, and suddenly he said it just a few weeks ago when he says, well, when you look at what's going on around us at the moment and what's happening with Russia and, them cutting off the gas to Europe and all that, we must therefore become more energy self-sufficient. Now, what could he mean by that? Could he, by any chance, be referring to fracking? I think he could, and indeed. We're being sold fracking in Britain now as the answer to everything. The economy will be marvellous, we'll all be rich, we'll have endless gas, we won't rely on any other country to give us energy, and it's going to be fantastic. Now, maybe this is not such a serious concern at this end of the aisles, but down south, what they're planning to do could actually destroy the very infrastructure of life in Britain. Let me explain. If you don't already know why there are some issues with fracking, basically what they do is use very high jet compressed water with additive chemicals in it to push out gas from under the ground. That's cutting a very long story short. And so they're saying, well, it's fine, it's not going to harm you, and it's all under the ground. Well, the problem is that when you start to look at what's going on around the world, it's having very dramatic and very dangerous effects. Drinking water, for instance, is being very much affected. This is from drinking water in Pennsylvania, in one of the areas where now fracking is ubiquitous. And there are now whole towns where you have to get bottled water in if you want any drinking water. They can no longer drink from the taps, partly because they have to use so much water to do the fracking. They're taking water from these areas and then using it to frack. But then when it comes out, it's contaminated. It will be contaminated for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The companies say, no, it won't be. And the companies have been given effectively the power to self-regulate themselves. When you start to look at the evidence is they do not follow the safety protocols they should. And time and again, we're getting reports of very dangerous polluted water. There is water under the ground that's going to build up gradually that is contaminated and eventually will seep into everything. So that is one concern. You also have the concern of seismic repercussions. Down near Blackpool, we had 2 earthquakes which are now known to be related to fracking, but they say, oh, that's fine, it was so rare, that won't happen again. Well, but even aside from all of that and claims of, gas coming through the taps and all of this, what about the actual effects on the environment? You see, people are being told fracking's fine, it'd be the odd rig here and there. Have you seen the aerial shots of what fracking actually does in countries where it's now big business? Have you seen? Let's look at an aerial shot of Pennsylvania. Because you cannot just have one rig. Once you have one and you frack under the ground, you've got to have another one to join, and so on and so on. It will destroy many areas of the countryside, and it will be very difficult to come back from this. It will pollute many parts of the country. And I can only hope, and there is a genuine hope here, that actually when people begin to really see the impact of this on their environment, because Pennsylvania is a big place, Britain is not. And particularly down to the southeast, there's a lot of people. There's not that much water. We have droughts often down there. and they're going to take all that water away and they're going to do this to the landscape. You're going to have to hope somebody, before it gets too out of hand, will say, hang on. And they're planning on doing this across vast swathes of Britain. Some think this is something to do with a project called Agenda 21. If you don't know anything about Agenda 21, look it up. There's a lady called Rosa Corey who did a very good speech in Denmark, which you will find on the internet, talking about Agenda 21, and lots of people are concerned. It began as a perfectly reasonable sort of booklet published at the end of the Rio Environmental Summit some years back, and it said, how can we be more environmentally sustainable in the future? And so it puts forward various ideas. And at first you think, well, that's all reasonable. We don't want to destroy the world. We want to keep it nice. The conspiracy view on Agenda 21, however, can be summed up by this image that I found on a conspiracy website. This is how many people see it, that it's a big black cloud about to affect us in a big way. Because underlying what they say is care for the environment seems to be a project that is going to make either life unsustainable in the countryside, where people then have to move into the cities, into more compressed population areas, which are, of course, more controllable, and gives them every land grab right they want. And bear in mind, David Cameron just 2 weeks ago has said they're changing the planning laws so that the fracking companies will be able to frack anywhere they want, and you will not be able to stop them, even if it's on your land. If the government says they want fracking, they'll have fracking. That is a fundamental, shall we say, attack. It's an attack on something we've all taken for granted, that somebody can't just come and do anything on your land. There are rules, there are laws. That's going out the window. And some think this is about Agenda 21. And the general view is that what they're trying to do is push people out of the countryside, either because they have got a fanatical green agenda, and then the world will be good and happy and there won't be any nasty people wrecking it. Or, as a lot of people think, the reason is that if there's no one out there, they can do what they want. And if you look at places like Antarctica and the Arctic, of course, they've just started drilling for oil recently. And these were environments we swore for years we would never destroy for going and drilling and digging and gas and oil. Now we are. And they're saying, well, yeah, we've got to, look at the world, look at the energy crisis, look at what's going on in Russia. It's okay, but we also know from history what happens to areas where this kind of stuff starts to be done. And I don't know if you heard on the news just recently, Greenland has come into the news. Now, Greenland, I mean, you don't really think about it, do you? If you actually look at it on a globe, it's nearly as big as South America. It's a huge continent. And hitherto, you don't hear much about it because it's been covered in ice. Now, climate change, and I'll talk about that in the second half, is clearly occurring for whatever reason. We'll discuss that later. And so some of the ice and snow is gradually melting off Greenland, and suddenly people are going, hey, you know what? We can now drill for oil here. Now, you might think the people in Greenland, there's not many of them, but there are people there, might be a bit worried about that. But in fact, it's quite the opposite. And just recently, we had their Prime Minister, Aleqa Hammond, selling the need to come and drill for oil in Greenland. And she's selling it as a humanitarian exercise, saying, listen, our people are very poor, they're disadvantaged. Come and drill. It'll bring all this money into the country, which immediately tells you, A, she's obviously in the pockets of the oil companies, but B, it tells you that Greenland is about to be sacrificed. And, we all talk about these lovely parts of the world. We don't want to damage them. We don't want to destroy them. And yet there is the very Prime Minister of that country literally inviting it, saying it's fine, and the ice is going, do what you want, it'll be lovely. And yet, and here's the paradox, right? Here's the big paradox. And yet, only a week after she said that, Ban Ki-moon, who is the Secretary General of the UN, or whatever he is, goes to Greenland to use Greenland as an example of the very kind of place we must preserve. Well, he and she are obviously not singing from the same hymn sheet. And it's an example of some of the many paradoxes that are now being thrown up that do not apparently make sense. Because they're always talking about the dangers of climate change, particularly man-made global warming, and the need to preserve the environment, which of course we must. And yet at the same time, you then get the other side of it, where they're happy to frack, they're happy to invite drilling for oil in these places. This is not quite making sense. Why is this? the second half of this presentation, I'm going to try and show how some of these paradoxes may be resolved, and more to the point, how we can actually make a difference to some of the key decisions that are currently being made, which do affect our lives. They affect our lives even though you might not have heard of them. We do have a choice. We do have an opportunity here to make a real difference to the way that decisions are made. We saw that with the Syrian war. They know if enough people focus their minds and make their opinions well known, they can't go too much against that. But you've got to galvanize people to stand up as one and say, hang on, we're a bit concerned about this. So there are choices ahead. And there are many dreams and many nightmares which are going to come all at the same time, especially through technology. And that's what we're going to come back and discuss in the second half is how can we make a difference? Where is this going to go? So we're going to take just 10, 15-minute break. And thank you very much for listening so far. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we left off talking about climate change. So let's bite the bullet here, because it's such a major issue of our times, or is at least sold to us as being so. You can't not look at it. Now, the first thing I'm going to say here, I am not a climatologist, obviously, so I don't know really what's going to happen. But the way that man-made global warming is being sold to us at the moment is absolutely fear-based, number one, which always makes me a bit suspicious. But number two, there are certainly sides to the argument that are not being given proper mainstream coverage. And that doesn't necessarily mean man-made global warming is real or not real, but, there are many scientists who do not think it is going to happen the way that we're being told. But what happens is as soon as they come out against the official view, they are classified as not scientists. They're not part of the scientific community anymore. They're just mavericks. So when you then get spun this often quoted statistic of something like 95% of all scientists agree that man-made global warming is real, what they're doing is being very manipulative, because they're not including lots of scientists who don't believe that, but they say, well, they're not scientists. If they believe that, they can't be scientists. It's incredibly wrong the way that they fiddle the statistics. But that doesn't mean it's not real. I want to look at this because even if you accept that it is real, there are certain, again, paradoxes that come into this. Now, we're told the climate's going to change. We're told it's getting warmer and will continue to, even though not all the data seems to say that. But let's run with that for a moment. Problem is, there are other things that could have a very dramatic effect. I'm kind of encouraged to see recently there's been more mainstream coverage of those that believe that this rather large object up in the sky may also affect the climate. There have been people out on the fringes for years saying, if you don't understand solar cycles, you're not going to understand climate change. So we've already heard that, wider solar cycles may in themselves play big pivotal roles in the development of life on this planet. But there are smaller cycles. You've got the basic 11-year sunspot cycle. You've then got wider cycles within cycles. It is now becoming clear that the behavior of the sun has a very dramatic effect on what happens down here. And currently, we had that 25-year burst or so of really high activity, and then suddenly it's going right down below the level they'd anticipated. Sunspots, for instance, are much less than they had expected. Now, that could continue, and if that does continue for a long time, you could find yourself, in fact, never mind global warming, back in a little ice age. Back in between the 1500s and the mid-1800s, we had a period of very cold winters in the Northern Hemisphere. And that's when you get all the Christmas cards of people skating on the Thames and all of this, where it froze over. You can barely imagine that today, but that was quite common back then. This seems to have coincided with a period known as the Maunder Minimum. Now that is basically a time where the sunspots were very, very few, because even in those years they were being monitored. And therefore, if we got a very quiet cycle of sunspots for the next couple of centuries, well, it doesn't matter what we're putting into the atmosphere, we're going to be headed for global cooling. And this is a factor that needs to be taken into account. You've got other factors. Increased cloud cover may well, for instance, be changing the climate, never mind anything to do with what we're putting into the atmosphere. So there are, shall we say, things that we cannot entirely predict. I don't know if you heard this news story just 2 or 3 weeks back, and this may turn out to be nothing, but it reminds us of something important. There were videos taken of animals running away from Yellowstone Park. Bison running away as if they were sort of sensing something, tremors or whatever. That could be important because if you don't know, Yellowstone Park is one of the biggest volcanic calderas in the world. And it is known for a fact it will sooner or later go off again. And if it does, it will create one of the biggest ash clouds we've ever known in history. And that ash cloud, if it were to go off, would basically create the equivalent of a nuclear winter around the world. There would be very poor harvest. There would certainly be famine in parts of the world. It would create a very cold climate for possibly decades. So interesting to note that there do seem to be more tremors in that part of the world. Maybe it's the build up to this, maybe it isn't, but one day it will happen. So, we always talk absolutely like, the climate sort of, it's going in this direction. Well, it might be now, but there's lots of variables within that. We don't know. As Harold Macmillan once said, events, dear boy, events. You get unexpected events and they can create changes of their own. But okay, let's say global warming is real. Let's say man-made global warming is absolutely where it's at. All right, let's go with that now for the moment. Because even if that's true, okay, why then are we behaving the way that we are? Because if that is true, and we're constantly assured it is, why is it that the same governments that are selling us all the guilt that it's our fault for ruining the planet are persisting with processes and manufacturing and energy processes that still create so much carbon, including fracking? Fracking is a fossil fuel. It will just release more carbon into the atmosphere. It doesn't quite seem to make sense. On one hand, they're telling us it's a terrible thing, we've got to be so careful. On the other hand, they still persist. They don't invest in energy that could be clean. So, for instance, there's been a bit of a war of words about these things in recent times. Wind turbines, solar farms. There are issues around them. Who wants a wind turbine next to them? There are issues. There are environmental impacts. They're not that efficient. But on the other hand, they are clean. I don't understand, however, though, why they won't invest in things like tidal power or wave power, which is shown to be a constant source of energy. With, the windmills, you've got to have the wind blowing or they sit there idle, and that's part of the problem. And that's when you get some of the criticism of them. Tidal power is guaranteed, and yet they won't invest, and yet they will invest in things like fracking. So when you start to look at the way this is portrayed in the media, you start to see things that don't quite add up. And absolutely in the media, there is now a storm against wind farms. We've seen it over and over again now. It's a constant mantra. This is bad news. It was a bad investment. We should never have done this. Now, that's all well and good if you've got a solution. So what are we going to have instead? Nuclear. Well, that's good, isn't it? We look forward to more nuclear power stations here, particularly after Fukushima. And of course, what's the other big solution? Fracking. Fracking's fine. We'll do that to the landscape. It's all right. That won't blight the landscape, will it? Well, it will. More than a bunch of windmills will. So there are things that just don't really add up. They seem to be coming from all angles at once and never really making coherent sense. Look at the media sort of storm against those who protest against fracking. We happen to live down near Balcombe, which is one of the first sites where they were doing test drilling. And we went down and, were there amongst some of the protesters because we feel very strongly about it. We know, therefore, ourselves, those protests were not reported accurately in the media. They always played the figures down. There were thousands of people there sometimes. It was always down to sort of 100 or so. And note how the BBC especially, and I'm going to say something about them in a minute, always managed to show the wrong picture. So one particular report of one of the anti-fracking protests showed a man wearing a dress. There was a man wearing a dress there, but he was one out of thousands of people. But that's the one they choose to show because it seeds in the public mind that these people are eccentrics, they're fringe, they're a bit nutty, don't worry about them. And absolutely, the mainstream media is against them. Now, why might that be? Particularly in the Murdoch press. I mean, the Mail's bad enough, but the Murdoch press, well, consider this. Rupert Murdoch is investing in fracking at the moment. So do you think you're going to get an accurate telling of the situation around fracking in his media? No, of course you're not. And this is the problem, that lobbying and big money is always speaking not accurate reporting, not the truth. And the media is a part of the problem. And this is one of the things we're up against. And when you read things like this, dirty tricks of the fracking deniers, what does that even mean, fracking denier? But, you know, it's very manipulative. And 9 times out of 10, these people are not represented accurately. And they keep telling you it's safe, it's fine. It's not. If you don't know the issues around fracking, do find out. You'll find it all out there. What about the media? So, okay, let's widen this out. The media, we know you cannot rely on. I give many talks to mainstream groups as well as truth groups, and that's people like Rotary clubs and even the Women's Institute. And I can ask the question, as I do frequently, hands up all those who believe everything they're told in the media. Not a hand will go up. Hands up those who believe everything they're told by the government. Not a hand will go up. Everybody knows they're lied to. Okay, you don't need to be on the fringe, you don't need to be a truth seeker to know that. We know that, and yet still we lazily go with the madness that we're fed by the media, because there's nothing else. So we kind of go with it. And we know it's not really true, a lot of it, and yet we still find ourselves drawn in. And I mean, you know, people like the BBC, they really are the worst. I mean, I like the BBC in many ways, but I'm afraid they are a propaganda tool, particularly after David Kelly. When Dr. David Kelly spoke to the BBC and was then exposed by the Blair administration, you know, the BBC was lambasted, and they are terrified of losing the licence fee because there goes the plug on the way they've operated. And I think they will lose it sooner or later. They're terrified, and now they will not do anything that might be seen to go against the government. So they are completely neutered. A lot of people think the BBC now has this rather sort of apt image shows it is basically just a way of bludgeoning you with the official truth. It's got nothing to do with what's really going on. They're very selective in the kind of pundits they have on there. You won't find anybody of the alternative persuasion there unless they're there to be made fun of. And I know that from my own experience where I've been involved in programmes, and, you know, you'll find the sceptics are given like 3/4 of the slot and you're lucky to get a few seconds. And that's the way it's edited against you. If you don't think the BBC is lying to you, here's just a modern one. Some of you will have seen this, but it's really worth pointing this out. While I say modern, a few years back, when Libya was being liberated, and the West was helping to liberate Libya from Colonel Gaddafi, these pictures got broadcast on the BBC. And they first went out on the BBC Breakfast Show, which we're seeing here. And this was apparently footage, live footage, of a protest in Green Square in Tripoli, celebrating the imminent downfall of Gaddafi. But then a few people who were a bit keen-eyed said, yeah, but hang on a minute. What do you mean, Libya? But look at that flag. Surely that's the Indian flag, isn't it? Okay, let's look at this flag in close-up. There it is. That's the Indian flag. And then people said, hey, these faces, I mean, if you look, they're kind of sort of Indian, really, aren't they? Want to see the Libyan flag, just to be sure? And sure enough, it turns out that this footage was from a demonstration in India a few days previously. It wasn't live footage. When this was pointed out by a few people, most people didn't spot it, but a tiny few wrote in and said, this can't be Libya. It was withdrawn. And the BBC were very sort of keen not to say anything about it, but they in the end issued a statement saying, sorry, it was an accident. We accidentally went to a live feed from India, except that footage was not being broadcast anywhere at that time. So A, it wasn't a live feed. B, how could it be a live feed? The BBC and all channels have very strict procedures in place to make absolutely sure inappropriate footage is not shown at the wrong time of the day. Otherwise, you'll be watching porn when you're watching the Teletubbies. It does not and cannot happen. It must have been footage that was sequestered. Somebody would have had to have signed it off to show it. It's war propaganda, plain and simple, because they needed some evidence to show the world that Gaddafi was about to fall, because that might in itself tip the balance, as indeed he did then fall. So here's the BBC blatantly showing stuff they know is not true. So that's just one image. We could give many, many other examples, but it's a reminder that the media is not to be relied on. Talking of which, it's very, I think, cogent to look at what they do report and what they don't report. So we've had endless stuff about Syria, and then endless stuff about Ukraine, and yet for months they failed to report what's going on in Venezuela, for instance. Now, it's just started in the last week or so to finally come into consciousness, which means I think somebody's decided it's time that we look at that. But maybe there's a reason they didn't want to report it. Hugo Chavez, of course, was a hugely popular leader, particularly amongst the poor in the population over there. And then when he died, there was a bit of a power vacuum. And, of course, what's happened is it's all fallen to rebel groups trying to get the upper hand, except for, interestingly, the big rebel group is almost certainly American-backed. And they're very pro-America. America hated Chavez with a vengeance. The guys on the streets now who are doing all this are very pro-America. They want to be part of America. And maybe that's why they didn't want to focus too much attention too soon onto this issue. So we heard almost nothing about Venezuela. It was almost like news blackout, even though what was going on there was almost as bad as Ukraine. And yet not reported over here. Other countries, yes, but here, no. It is heavily filtered. And need I say, as a very brief mention, anybody, for instance, who questions the truth about huge events like 9/11 ain't going to get any serious coverage. In fact, the BBC in particular debunks them with series like The Conspiracy Files that purports to be telling you about people who believe in conspiracy theories, but it's just there to demolish them by omitting all the key information and just blatantly lying, to be frank. At the last poll, over half the population of the world, they took various polls for the 10th anniversary of 9/11, over half the population does not believe the official story of 9/11. That's enormous. So the majority now doubt. There are differences within that demographic as to what they think did happen, but, they don't trust what they're told. Will you hear that reported in the mainstream news? You will not. You would think by watching the mainstream news that most people believed it. Only nutters would question it, but they don't. Most people do not believe it, as the statistics show. By the way, if you weren't already aware of the issues around 9/11, do find out. There are some flyers I've left outside with websites. If you've not checked this out, I'm assuming most of you know this inside out, but not always. From the small hole in the size of the Pentagon, which doesn't fit a 757, to the very plain, very visual evidence for explosives being used to bring down those towers, i.e. not a natural collapse, to the fact that we've got molten metal running down the towers. No metal could have burnt that hot in anything in the official story. Even if you believe everything in the official story, no temperature could have melted steel. And to the fact that you have utterly bizarre things like good old Building 7 collapsing in its own footprint later on that day, even though it was never hit by an aeroplane. These are just the first things. There are lists and lists and lists and lists. How they came down? Was it nanothermate? Was it Judy Wood's energy theories? Who cares? What we've got evidence of is that the official story doesn't make sense. So choose whatever alternative you want, but make sure you get clued up before you have an opinion about 9/11, because absolutely it's one of the biggest lies in history and is seen as one of the biggest events in the New World Order project. But I don't want to say any more about this really today. But there is a resonance with what's going on now, the Malaysian aeroplane. We could be here all night discussing alternative theories of the Malaysian aeroplane. You don't know where it went, I don't know where it went. My suspicion, which is the general suspicion of many, is that either it was shot down or either it was accidentally knocked out of the skies by either an American plane or a Chinese plane, and either side doesn't want you to know how it happened, or something even more bizarre happened, or maybe it just crashed. and it's somewhere under the ocean, but they're clearly not being straight. I think we can all see that. They've contradicted themselves. They've led a merry dance all the way down the line of the way they report it. There's something very not right about this story. But that aside, and maybe it'll never be solved, maybe it will be, but even if they claim they found debris next week, there's always now going to be people that won't believe it. It's a guaranteed conspiracy theory forever now. But look at some of the curious things that have come out of this that reveal paradoxes, inconsistencies in the way the media reports things. So one of the big deals about 9/11 for the truth community was that the transponders, the automatic beacons, were switched off. And yet that doesn't seem to be much of an issue for the Malaysian aircraft. Not really. So this is a 777, like the one that we're missing. Here's the transponder. What is a transponder? It's just basically a beacon that sends out a signal. One of the sort of big fusses that was made about this was that, who turned off the transponder? Why did they turn the automatic beacon off? And there's been a fuss. And yet on 9/11, all the hijacked planes had their transponders turned off. Nobody reported that in the mainstream. That's not seen of any consequence. And yet suddenly it's a big consequence. I just thought that was interesting. And there was something else too. The BBC almost put their foot in it here. They ran a story saying, why wasn't anybody receiving phone calls from the people on the aeroplane? Because one theory is the plane flew on, the Malaysian plane, flew on for a long time before it then did whatever it did. And they said, why aren't there phone calls? And the BBC gave the answer, and they said, well, that's because it was flying at 30,000 feet. Well, that's funny, because on 9/11, the plane that didn't hit a building and eventually came down in the woods, Flight 93, which has now been turned into at least 2 movies, that, of course, is the famous flight where we are told there's many, many calls from people, many phone calls from the people on there. That was flying at 34,000 feet. Oddly, we got loads of calls from that flight, and yet people are making a fuss now saying, well, you wouldn't be able to do that. And yet on 9/11, that wasn't a problem, apparently, even though, so they contradict themselves, and then they don't pick it up. The BBC report even mentioned Flight 93, and then didn't pick up the paradox. So I'm just pointing out here the inconsistencies in the way they report things. They report things in a way that is convenient to basically toe the establishment line. Oh, by the way, they did come up with their own theory. I love the fact, as it were, that the Daily Star, or whatever, Sunday Sport, beg your pardon, you've got all these relatives there in tears and want to know, and they run this headline to make you all laugh. Plane found on the moon. Oh, maybe it is on the moon. I don't know. But, it's an interesting point to make that the media, again, it contradicts itself. It doesn't really care about the relatives. As long as it sells papers and there's a laugh, be all right. Okay, there's some good news here. So we can't rely on the mainstream media. That we know. We know that anyway, but we've just shown that. There is something else going on, which is, of course, enormously helpful. This diagram here looks like a brain or a network of neurons, and in a way it is. This is a diagram of the internet. If you sort of trace all the different stations of the internet and somebody's finally done it, that's what you get. That's what the internet looks like, rendered as a diagram. Beautiful. And it really is like something growing, and it really is like an entity in its own right. And indeed, that's what many people think it is. There's a lot of talk at the moment about collective consciousness, and I'll say something about that in a moment. And that the more we focus our minds on the same thing at the same time, the more collectively ripples seem to pass out throughout the whole population. So, of course, the mainstream media has led us almost entirely until the internet was born. And now suddenly we can exchange information about anything. And that brings dreams and nightmares. The shadow side to that, obviously, but there's the plus side. Hang on, the media, which continually misrepresents what people really believe, is suddenly being sidelined, particularly a lot of young people. They wouldn't watch the news, they wouldn't buy the Daily Express to hear what's going on. They should look at the internet. And they will choose their truth. Now, there's a good and bad to that. Often you can choose only one truth and not look at all the others. But if you're being discerning and sensible, you'll get a better sense of all the alternatives that are out there. And you can think for yourself. And many people think that's a massive step forward in the development, actually, of the global brain, the global consciousness. Finally, we're all in touch with anybody and everything. Access to anything, good and bad. but access to stuff you couldn't have had very easily, even just 15 years ago, suddenly it's there, which may be, of course, why lots of people up there at the top would love to shut it down. I mean, did you see what happened in Turkey the other week? So Turkey, the Prime Minister or President, whatever he is, didn't much like the fact he was being criticised on the net, so he shut the net down. So it can be done. Luckily, it did create a massive outcry. This is one of the protests on the streets. And it's back on, but now with heavy censorship. Now, China, of course, has heavily censored its internet for a while, but if you know what you're doing, there are ways around this. But nonetheless, this is evidence that the powers that be know the genie's out of the bottle. They're very afraid. I don't think they anticipated that the net would take off as fast as it has and to such a degree, and now they don't know how to put that genie back in the bottle. But boy, they're trying. And don't think we in the West are immune to this. They wouldn't be quite so crass as to say we're closing down the internet because they know there'd be riots. But they're doing it in a different way. I don't know if you caught this one recently. So David Cameron, in his wisdom, has said we do not want children to have access to pornography. Fair enough. Big social issues around that. But his solution is that what's going to happen is your server, one of these days, is going to send you a message. And it will say, do you want to be able to access pornographic material? Yes, no. And so a lot of people go, oh, no, of course not. So you click no. What they're not telling you is that when you click no, you are also closing the door on a lot of other material that's in the small print, including esoteric content. Do you know this? So in the small print of the initial proposals, and it's now being argued about, you will also, all access to esoteric content will be blocked. So you say, no, I don't want to see pornography. They're putting anything spiritual, alternative, truth-seeking in the box of pornography. That's how they see it. And suddenly, so if you went to look at, say, a truth website or even a spiritual website, you won't be able to run it. You go, oh, why is that? And it will say, because you don't want to see this kind of material. And you go, oh, yes, oh, I better not look at that. This is really happening. Right, I can't believe David Cameron even thought he could get away with this. People have challenged it. If you see the small print of this is obviously from a website that's campaigning against this. It says this was going to come in by the end of 2013. Well, it didn't, because enough people made a fuss that they're trying to have to look at this now and adjust the small print, keep us happy. But you can bet your life they are going to block as much as they can. Okay, in the name of doing a good thing. It's very clever, it's very subtle. They don't have to ban the internet, they'd never get away with that, but they can do it this way. And there's another way they can do it too, which is to make the internet very attractive if you look at certain sites that are run by the big corporations. It's already been proposed that you then start to license the internet, like you have a license for a TV company. You want to run a website? You've got to have a license for it. This is a proposal that's been made now and it's being taken seriously. And you've got to prove, therefore, that what's on your website is true and that you're not trying to mislead anybody. Right, can you imagine, say, 9/11 Truth website getting through that process? No. Or what will happen is it will only be allowed onto the backwaters of the net, whereas most people will sign up. You will sign up for packages of websites you can look at, all the big ones, the corporate ones, all the ones that you think you want to see, never even knowing that there's all these other ones there which might be challenging what they're saying. This is happening, right? This is not science fiction. We need to protect the internet because it's been one of the very things that's actually propelled things forward in the last 15, 20 years because they can't hide information. In the old days, it had to be done by pamphleteering and books, but that was easier to control. Note how in any revolution in the olden days, the first thing they'd do, the authorities would shut down the printing presses because they knew it was the flow of information that really mattered. And they're trying to do the same thing now, but through the back door. We need to be very careful of this because if you believe, as many do, that the development of the internet was a crucial step forward in human evolution, these are the powers that be trying to actually take human evolution backwards. It's that serious, and it really is that serious. We need to beware. And there's more, of course, because the internet's not just going to be a thing on a screen in front of you soon. Google Glass has just been introduced. And on one level, it's an amazing thing. It might make you look a bit of an idiot. But if you don't know about this, it means you can access the internet anytime, anywhere as you walk around. It will beam images into your glasses that will interact with the environment that you are walking in. And what you will see if you're wearing one of these is basically this. You walk around and information will come. You look at somebody and you get a little run of data, tell you who they are, what they are, where they live. If it's anywhere on the internet, worrying, isn't it? How's this for the ultimate surveillance tool? And then adverts will come out. If it thinks you're going to be interested in something in that environment, ads will come up. And it's brilliant in a way, and it will show you, the shops around the corner if you want to go there, and it'd be fantastic for directions, and yet worrying. It's a good thing on one level in terms of you can imagine the possibilities, but on the other level, this worries a lot of people because of its potential misuse. And there's another issue, of course. The Google Glass is just the beginning. They're already developing contact lenses you can wear. So, in fact, you won't even know anybody's doing this to you soon. They might be looking at you and seeking out all your data, and you wouldn't know it. And then it would be the brain implant, which people like David Icke have been talking about for years, and now it's happening. So there again, conspiracy theorists proved right. And the technology, the interface of biology and technology is going to change the world so fundamentally, it's going to happen so quickly that we need to make sure we go through this period of transition into it with full consciousness. Because at the moment, we're rushing into it without really thinking of what's going on. It's happening so fast. We're not discerning, and the ethics of it are really, really important. We've got to think really carefully about what we're doing. We could go on, and this is another talk, really, because, they're saying now robots and computers are going to basically take over the world within 50 years. They'll be far better than us, and it will be science fiction come true. And then where do we sit in this? Where does the human race sit in this? We're making a world for computers, not for us. How long before we're suddenly completely redundant? But that's another story for another time. Coming back to the present, or near present, so when you've got the internet in your head all the time, that's a marvellous thing. You've got the global brain active all the time. It might have a profound effect on a collective consciousness of mankind. But equally, who's going to be present? Already, come on, people walk around with their iPhones, don't they? They're not really there. Kids in a room, they're not really with you. They're somewhere else. And this will now be, people will be sort of in a daze. And before you know it, it'll be the Matrix. We'll just live in virtual reality. Why go out the door when you can have every reality you want? When it becomes indiscernible from normality, this is the way we're heading. And it might be marvellous. If you're living in a horrible environment, why live there? When you can live somewhere lovely. But at the same time, you can see the dangers. You're sensible, intelligent people. We are now moving into this period of time where the very fundamentals of what it is to be human are now up for grabs. And we need to really seriously consider where this is going to take us. But kind of rolling back just to some basics, there's something else it's going to do. It's going to change the way we make decisions. Okay. Now already, young people, the politicians say young people are not engaged with politics. I wonder why. But we'll come to that. And a lot of young people have responded by saying, well, we might be. If we could use our phones to vote, because I do everything through the phone, I might vote. If I could vote through the phone, that's what some people want. They say, oh, no, we can't do that because the technology is not reliable enough. And it probably isn't yet. How would you know those electronic votes won't be fiddled? And some say that's already happening with the electronic voting there is. But in the end, they probably would become a fail-safe mechanism. Okay, so then how long is it before people are going to say, so now why can't we make our decisions this way? You see, young people, I'm not being condescending here. Helen and I, we got kids, okay, of various kinds, as it were, and they're not interested in this. They look at this, and it's like, what? Sorry, what's this? Oh, they're running the country. Okay. Right, fine. And they just look at the way that the decisions are made in this country politically, and this just looks like something out of ye ancient times. They have no interest in this, for the most part. That is not universally true. Obviously, there are exceptions, but mostly they can't really engage in it. And you see, part of the problem also is the basic behaviour of the people in the chambers. Forgive me for not showing Holyrood, but you get the idea. The way, certainly, the politicians behave just does not command any respect. And particularly younger people who they say they want to engage in the political process just look at it and think, these are a bunch of tossers. Why? Why would I even vote for them? They're working for lobbyists, they're not working for us. You've got essentially around 600 people in a chamber making decisions that often go against what the collective seems to want. They vote for wars we don't want. with the exception of the Syrian thing. They vote things in which are clearly keeping the lobbyists happy, the arms companies, the big business, the banks. Not working for us, so why would I vote for them? And you see, the thing is, when eventually the technology comes around that you can make decisions using technology, and in fact, everybody could say what they thought about any dilemma of the day by just voting, except for it won't be in your hand, it'll just be up here, and you go, yes, no, or whatever, I'm simplifying. How long will it be, I wonder, before people say, why are we leaving these idiots to make these decisions when we could all collectively make this decision? True collective responsibility. I mean, already people vote for a vase or whatever, and some people think they're manipulations. But, people make their feelings known, online petitions. Why couldn't you run the world like that? You might not get good decisions, I grant, but there'd be real collective decisions, and that would need to be seriously looked at. This is going to come up. Maybe it's 100 years down the line, maybe less, but sooner or later people are going to say, why can't we all do this? We've got the technology. Everything is going to shift. And do you think, with that availability, that people are going to still want to turn up at these things? I mean, it's already true. There's going to come a time people are going to go, sorry, what's that? Oh, polling booth, polling. So you get a pencil on a string and you write a pencil X on a piece of paper. This is already a joke. Now, okay, I'm not demeaning, in fact, far from it, the need to have a vote of some kind. And in some countries, just to be able to make that pencil X is a massive step forward. But the whole way we run our democratic system is going to shift. Notwithstanding the fact that many of the decisions made by our parliaments, of course, are being handed down to them from people above, be it the Bilderbergs or whoever. But nonetheless, there is a certain decision-making we can do on a normal, everyday level. That's where it gets interesting when you get characters like Russell Brand come along. Because Russell Brand's a fascinating person. I mean, he's a comedian, he's a bit wild and wacky, but he does say some things that are very relevant. But others, of course, have said, yeah, but who's this guy really on the side of? I mean, he's very good in TV interviews because he just points out the basic hypocrisy of journalists by just throwing it back to them and pointing out here's the rubbish they're talking. He's very good. But then he started to talk about politics and he's saying, don't vote. If you vote, you're supporting a system that no longer works. Don't vote. I vote revolution. That's his phrase, well, what does that mean? There's been many kinds of revolution in history. The trouble is, they so often don't work. Well, you just replace the old system with something that's essentially the same as, the old system, but you're calling it a new system. There's a danger here, because I understand where he's coming from, but at the same time, I think, and this is a personal view, there are people on high who would be very happy the less interest we show. They might make a noise about wanting us all involved, but actually, the more we say we don't really care what you do, the more they go, hey, great, we'll just carry on doing what we want to do. I think there's a danger there. If you look around you in the world, at where the major trouble spots are, and this is a simplified map, orange, a lot of trouble, black, dark, very bad, trouble, wars, strife. It's nearly always where there isn't a proper rule of law, and it's nearly always where the democratic system is shaky and often violated. Democracy, as we call it today, does bring a certain order. There is an order we have taken for granted. Now, I'm not being condescending here, because often people, they look at the trouble spots of the world and say Central Africa, and they go, oh, look, there was tribal warfare. These people, they need civilizing. Hang on, how long was it ago that we, say the British Isles, but the West, we were in exactly the same position? And the answer is, not very long ago. We've been through exactly the same thing, as I will demonstrate in a minute. First thing I want to say, though, is some good news. I don't want you to get the wrong idea here. There's wars and there's trouble and strife around the world, but as people like this man are pointing out, actually, we're on the right curve. Steven Pinker is a well-known philosopher, American, and written all sorts of very fascinating psychological books and all of this, but he wrote a book a couple of years back called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And he traces the history of violence, basically, the history of warfare and killing, and just by looking at the statistics shows how it's gradually petering out by the increase in law and order, and not surveillance, not oppression, not totalitarianism, just general normal society getting itself into a sorted way of being. And he comes up with some really fascinating statistics. I'll just throw a few at you here. It's worth knowing. He says, for instance, the number of people killed in wars has dropped 1,000-fold in the last few centuries. Global genocide deaths now 1,400 times lower than 70 years ago. Murder rates in Europe down from 100 in 100,000 5 centuries ago to 1 in 100,000 today. Rape in the US down by 80% since 73. Racial and sexual discrimination is down. Lynchings in the US have ceased altogether, and the number of oppressive authoritarian regimes has dropped from 90 in 1976 to just 25 today. The funny thing is, he's been attacked for saying this, because we're fed a very negative view of the world by the media. We look at all the stories about war and terrible things, and some people say, you're a liar, I see the news and I see the reality. And he's going, look at the statistics. Never mind what they're telling you. We know the media feeds off fear and negativity. Look at the facts. So that's interesting. So maybe there is some good news. We're on the right sort of path here. But, okay, let's look at British history for a moment. How long ago was it we were full of tribalism and terrible killings and massacres and egos fighting? The Wars of the Roses, for instance, 1300s, went on for decades, was basically a civil war in England, but it wasn't really about any great principle or ideals. It was just, one warlord beating off another. This went on for ages. Terrible, terrible wars. The Battle of Towton saw 28,000 people die on one day. We're dealing with terrible figures here, but that doesn't seem to happen here anymore. And the reason it doesn't is that gradually we sort of learn, actually, this is self-destructive. One war that you will be more than aware of course, was the English Civil War, which, of course, was a British Civil War and had huge consequences for Scotland. And it boiled down in a way to something fundamental in our belief systems that we're still dealing with today, which is who speaks for God. Because part of it, and it is of course far more complex than this, but part of it was Charles I absolutely was brought up and believed he spoke for God. God had chosen him to be the monarch, and that's it. So his word was law. But of course then parliamentarians and all of this started to say, well, yeah, hang on a minute. Yeah, but it doesn't mean you can just do anything. And then it began to be questioned, hang on a minute, who is speaking for God here? Cromwell, who I'm sure you'll all love, came into the picture quite late. In fact, most of the civil wars had essentially finished by the time he came to power. And at first, he came to power selling it on this, that no, the king does not speak for God. We need to get rid of him and behead him. We all speak for God. But actually, the truth was, he thought he spoke for God. This was a man absolutely devoted to the cause that he was doing God's work. Cromwell's vision of what was going on in the English Civil Wars is fascinating to look at. First of all, do not underappreciate how big that was. More people died in that civil war than in World War I and World War II put together. It was hideous. And yet, through all of this came a sort of an order, oddly. But Cromwell, he absolutely believed what was going on here, this was the final book of Revelation. This was the apocalypse happening here in the British Isles. He was fighting for God. He truly believed that. He saw this as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Not over in Israel, it was here. We were carrying it on. That's crucial to understand. But gradually, and after Cromwell died and they restored to Charles II and the monarchy came back, but they never quite had the same power, and then it all went horribly wrong and they started to be a bit too Catholic for some people's liking. And so then finally they had the Glorious Revolution, invited the Dutch to invade us, at which point suddenly it didn't make any sense anymore, because in fact we were all calling the shots. Was William speaking for God? Well, maybe, but actually does it really matter? How about let's just get rich instead? So, people like Walpole, the first essentially prime minister, although he wasn't called that, said, you know what, never mind, let's just make money. We don't want these civil wars. And so we became a business. And okay, there's pros and cons to all of that, but out of it suddenly came a sense of order. And we've never had civil war since. You get the occasional strife. And it could be argued this is exactly what's going on in some parts of the world today. And through no fault of their own, they're just at a different stage to us. So we can look overseas and say, oh, look at those people being so primitive. We were the same mere hundreds of years ago, and maybe they will be the same as us or even overtake us. Order will finally restore. I truly believe this, but I think, therefore, we all need to partake of the system to help bring this about. That's why I don't really agree that we don't partake, because then you're leaving it to people that might cause more trouble in the long run. There are resonances with the time, which was essentially sort of 1640s, 1650s, the time of that civil war. There are resonances today with some of the things that are happening. Because suddenly, as people were saying, aha, well, you've killed the king, so the king didn't speak for God. So actually, we were brought up to believe he did. So in fact, everything's up for grabs. Okay, yeah, maybe God's will is being lived out on everybody in the British Isles. So therefore, whatever we do is going to be right, because it will work itself out. And then you had incredible things like, John Lilburn, the Levellers, and they said, all right, yeah, we need a completely new political system. We all need the vote, universal suffrage, and various ideas were put forward, which even now, some of them have still not come to pass, some have. But it was like, yeah, let's rewrite the world anew. And it's fascinating to look at the ideas that came out of it. There were other bunches, like the Diggers. And the Diggers said, yeah, in fact, if you look at the Bible, which they did still believe, of course, very strongly, they said the land is ours. Human beings were given the land. God gave it. So in fact, no minister or king can tell us who can own the land. The land is ours. So they started to dig and plant. And places like Cobham down in Surrey, they just took over the land. And then, of course, got persecuted and killed a lot of them. But they were trying to show, hang on, who are you to tell us? And so suddenly everything was up for grabs. You had the ranters. I mean, if you look at their beliefs, they said, okay, actually, all men are equal. God made us equal, and he also made us perfect. So everything we do is perfect. So they started to experiment sexually, and they'd have like group sex and stuff that even today would be shocking to some people. They said, no, this is fine because this is what God wants. Otherwise, why would we be able to do it? So they went on a completely different course. It was almost like anarchy breaking out. But then on the other hand, you had people like the Quakers. Now they kind of took a different not quite Puritan, but a more solemn way of looking at it. But they did say, and this was incredibly threatening to many people at the time, actually God speaks through us. Everyone, you, me. No minister, no bishop can tell you what your experience of God is. And in fact, they've gone on to do incredible work, especially campaigning against arms and things like that. But at the time, this was incredibly threatening. Here's a publication at the time, The World Turned Upside Down, taking the piss out of all these people, saying, what the hell's going on? We need to restore order in this country, get back to where we were. The world's gone mad. And it felt like that. They felt threatened. And yet today, there are ideas, there are whole things coming up that challenge our very idea of what it is to be human. I mean, the gay marriage law, which now law. A lot of people felt very threatened by that and said, this is against the law of... And then they had to think about that because obviously very religious people, they've got their convictions, so they can say God. Others who weren't sure, that actually they thought, well, I don't know, I just know it's wrong. But they couldn't really justify it because if you're not talking God, well, what would your objection be to that? And if enough people want something and you've got no real objection, well, why can you stop that happening? And yet, that caused an enormous fuss. I think part of the reason such a fuss was caused was it wasn't handled very well because marriage throughout centuries has been seen as a man and a woman. So for David Cameron, okay, it was more of a European law, but nonetheless, Cameron sold this to say, no, we will have it. That was like him saying, I speak for God. A lot of people didn't like that because it was like, hang on a minute, who are you to make this decision? Shouldn't we have had a few truth and reconciliation committee meetings first throughout the country or something, to see how we all feel? But they pushed it through, and I think that's why it caused ructions. But in the end, we're getting used to it already. It's like, gay marriage, what the hell? Unless you're very religious. And yet, although we have moved forward in so many ways, of course, then you also had David Sylvester, the UKIP candidate, say the flooding in Britain this year was God's punishment for gay marriage. So in some ways, we haven't moved on very much at all. And so still, we've got this God-fearing thing going on. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong or right. If you're religious, I 100% respect that. But, it's funny how everything's now up for grabs again. Nobody really is quite sure what means what. And maybe that makes life ever so exciting at the moment because it opens doors of opportunity like the ranters and the diggers and the Quakers were doing. They were saying, hey, the doors are open, a crack. Let's push them open and see whether we can rewrite the world. That's going on now. There are massive decisions. I mean, just take the decision, do we want to be in the EU? That fundamentally makes British people question who they are. Who are we in the world? Do we want to be part of this bigger federal thing? And Nigel Farage, I don't know, it's a funny thing. Too much of UKIP's fear-based for my liking, but I don't know. Let's see how it pans out. And he's been given an awful lot of coverage for a man with no seats in Parliament. But that again, the media is leading that. And there is a discussion, there is a debate there to be had. And similarly, of course, you got that big one coming up round the corner, the independence vote. I think it's a fascinating thing because it's making British people, Scottish people, and English people fundamentally have to question, who are we? Where do we want to actually go? What's the best way forward here? This is a real doorway to something new. And it seems to me, maybe I'm wrong because I live far down in the south where we're even north of Watford's an alien land to most people down there. You know what I mean? But it seems to me that there is a gut feeling that it's needed, that it's required. And I think even if the vote doesn't get a yes this time round, within a decade, I think it will. Maybe I'm wrong and I've completely misread it. But I think it's a bit like gay marriage. It's so obviously rolling that way. So that's where it's going to go eventually. If it does, though, consider this. You'll have to fundamentally consider what you are and where you are going as a nation. Think what it's going to do to the English. They just are not going to know what to do with themselves. It will fragment England. It's going to have a very fundamental... Already the Cornish are wanting to go independent. They've just been granted a bit more independence. You're going to get regions of England saying, right, hang on a minute, right, they are now completely independent. We want a parliament for this part of England. And we want what they've got over there. It's amazing. It's going to create such a kind of whole, reassessment of who we are and what we want. Whichever way it goes. And of course, if it doesn't, you're going to then have ructions amongst yourself. Did it go the right way? Why didn't it? It's not going to settle until it goes one way clearly or the other. So we're in really fascinating times. It's fundamental, and these same issues are going on right around the world. I'm using, because this is the country I live in, right? Britain today, whatever that will be soon. I'm using that as an example because I think we do often, for some weird reason, tend to constellate stuff that's going on around the world. People around the world are having to really question what they are. And some of the situations that look hopeless and terrible do actually often suddenly resolve. I mean, Rwanda had terrible stuff 20 years ago. Suddenly, it's looking like they have learnt their lesson. It's getting very ordered there, and there's truth and reconciliation stuff going on. You know, it's not impossible that change may come faster than you think. Just briefly to go back to esoterica, I am a believer in astrology, and some people go, oh my God. Well, look at the statistics. I refer you to the work of John Anthony West or Chris Ellerman. Look them up. There's lots of people out there just showing statistically it works. How it works, another matter, another argument. Percy Seymour, an astronomer, he says it works. And he's got all sorts of complex scientific reasons for why he thinks it does. It does. My wife Helen is a psychological astrologer. Have a chat with her later if you want to know more. I do believe there's something to this, and therefore the ages, the astrological ages, they become important with other shifts. So you've got the ancient time cycle, you've got just general collective shift going on right now in amongst people anyway, and you also got an astrological shift. There are arguments about what the ages are. Essentially, the definition of an age is merely the zodiacal sign that the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere rises into. And it will roughly stay in one sign for about 2,000 years, and then it moves on. So it's currently moving from Pisces into Aquarius. Now, what that means is, if you believe in the astrological meanings, a lot of shift is going to change. Pisces, was very much about sort of suffering and hard stuff. Now we're going to a more heady sort of technological age, which is already happening. Some scholars would say, no, it's not going to happen for 600 years. It's too early. Others say it's already happened. There's debates. But the general consensus is it's roughly every 2,000 years. Now, even if you don't believe in astrology, you can look back through the cycles of history and see there is a shift every 2,000 years. So maybe there's some other factor. But here's the thing. And even if you don't believe in any of that, this still counts. Go back 2,000 years. And we were at the height of the Roman Empire, as it had just become then, from a republic. And it seemed that, the world was set. You had the gods. So their gods then were not just a god, it was a pantheon of gods. These were believed in and worshipped, and that's how it was. And you would have gone back in a time machine and walked around and said, this could never change. But of course, within 400 years, it had crumbled away. And all those gods were history, and the new god, Christianity, had arrived. And then from that, there were other Abrahamic faiths, Islam, and suddenly it shifted. And this lot were history. And now they're just ruins, and it's just a memory. And the point I'm trying to make here is that you might look around the world today and say some things seem so set in stone, there's no way they're going to change. But history is not like that. Just when you think it can't change, suddenly it does. It seems to always take 300 years, 400 years. So those, for instance, who were expecting massive change on 21st of December 2012 were probably being a bit hopeful. But it was the beginning of a period of shift. It might take a long time. And yet, when you look back, in geological time, 300 years is nothing. Nothing. That's fast change. And I think we're at the beginning of just such a change now, where everything we think's normal will be gone. And with the technological interface with biology, it's going to accelerate it even more, I'm very sure. I don't know if anybody knows the tarot pack. Whether you believe in tarot or think it's rubbish, doesn't really matter. The symbolism I like. The fool represents all of us. Doesn't mean he's an idiot. Okay, it just means he's a fool because he's a bit happy-go-lucky. We start a journey like this. As you go through the pack, it's how the fool learns. It's the journey of learning through the world. And the fool card's rather nice because he's perfectly happy, singing, and there's got a little dog running along, but he's about to go off the cliff because he's not really thinking, and whoa, off he goes if he doesn't get the wisdom that he needs. And I think this is where we are now. There's a window of opportunity opening up, but if we don't do the changes with conscious awareness, of course, we're going to fall down the cliff. We need instead, obviously, to do this, okay? Make that leap. I really feel we're being offered an opportunity, but it means everybody's got to grasp the opportunity and make it what it should be, and not just do what we often do, is just go along with it and then sort of very randomly you get change. It's not always good change. There is an opportunity. Everything at the moment is up for grabs. If you do believe in collective consciousness, you will know that maybe you don't need to change every single person one-to-one on the earth to get change. I mean, some of the best work in looking at collective consciousness has come from this man, and there's many others. I'm just using him as one example. Dean Radin, absolutely a scientist, worked at Princeton University, and he just became aware that the data that show that our minds do affect the world around us directly, particularly when we're focused, intent, and the weight of numbers helping. He just does a meta-analysis of all the experiments that show that what we think changes the world. And he demonstrates, yeah, it works. Read his book, Entangled Minds, and you'll come out going, oh, yeah. And yet science is still pretending this isn't an issue. But he was one of the people that founded the Global Consciousness Project, where they found that when lots of people focus their minds on the same thing at the same time, they can make computers react with no physical connection between the two. And this is being used as evidence that what we all think reshapes the world. When you get big events like 9/11, but also good things like the Olympics, where lots of people focus their minds on something, these machines they just leave running randomly react. And they found there are patterns of response where we're all collectively reshaping the world. And he and other researchers believe that this is the beginning of a process whereby we could shift consciousness, even just by changing the way we think. And eventually a critical mass will be reached. I think the work of Rupert Sheldrake and people like this show you only need about 13% of the population to change their behaviour or shift, and suddenly the whole species takes it on. So maybe the big task of changing things for the better is not quite as big as it seems. And when you then match that with action, okay, think what can be achieved. In fact, you don't need to think it, you can see it in history, okay? Because I really want to close on and up. So we've got a few minutes. So just bear with these final thoughts, because this is crucial to understand. Look back at history when people have gathered together and when they focused their intent and got up and stood up for a cause, and see how much good it does. Now, a sort of a half example, in Britain, for instance, genetically modified food has been massively held back by the population saying, no, I don't want you fiddling with my food. Now, gradually the propaganda's working, it's being sold to us gradually, and now we're getting used to it, which is a shame. But companies like Monsanto have really struggled in this country because enough people said, no, hang on a minute. And they've stood up for themselves. I mean, this might seem silly, but like the campaign for real ale has saved many pubs and breweries from going down the pan by standing up against the big conglomerates just because they want a decent pint of beer. But it's worked. Shame you need alcohol to galvanise people sometimes, but it works. CND, have we still got nuclear weapons? Yes, but I suppose you could argue the fact they haven't been used since World War II is a good sign. And maybe if people hadn't made the fuss they had, it would be far worse in proliferation now than it could have been. Because similarly, like when loads of people came out and protested against Iraq or going to war in Iraq with the big weapons of mass destruction thing, that's because they felt in their gut that it was wrong. Now, we did go to war in Iraq, as you all know, but had people not made their feelings known in their millions around the world, we probably would have been bombing Iran 5 years ago by now, had people not said, actually, we do care what you do in our names. And hence the Syrian vote last year. People remember suddenly, think, hang on, you didn't listen to us last time. We want to be heard. And it's having an accumulative effect. It doesn't happen instantly. But you look back and you see suddenly things do come to a head. The Berlin Wall, for instance, yes, it was politically convenient for that wall to come down for both sides by then. That is true, but it still happened far more quickly, it's generally reckoned, than it should have done, because enough people got over their fear and decided, no, enough's enough. And they stood on the wall in such numbers that in the end, what are you going to do, gun them all down? And it wasn't going to work. And so suddenly there was shift and change, and for all that Putin's trying to turn the clock back today, nonetheless, this was a massive change for the world. Going back a bit, well, what about voting? I mean, ladies, you can vote, but you couldn't once, and once, people were throwing themselves in front of horses to get a vote. Now you've got to vote, and you're going, I can't think of anyone to vote for, but that's another story. There are people around the world dying just to get a single vote today. People had to go through terrible trauma, but they did it by just continually restating their needs and collectively standing up and not giving in to fear. And it worked. Nelson Mandela, I mean, who would have thought all those years of captivity, 2 years after his release, he'd be president of South Africa? There was enough consciousness which was applied to the issue that shifted people's perception of it and the perception of what was possible. And you'll find example after example like this in history. Solidarity. You weren't meant to have a union under the heavy communist regime in Poland, and yet they insisted they were going to have a union. And it just kept on going, and they had terrible trouble and strife. But in the end, when the old communist oppression finally fell apart, they formed the first government. And Poland's got trouble still, but hey, it was a step forward. And we're dealing here with things that take time. Back in 2011, our government wanted to sell off the English forest land. Now, that's not a very sensible thing to do. If you go back to old Arthurian myth, the land, and the people were one and the same. You can't just take the land away, and they were trying to sell it off to foreign investors, saying, we're just going to sell your forest, and they can do what they want. Think of the money we'll make. And people collectively said, no. You've gone too far. And I think, again, the government didn't anticipate the reaction. There was so much of a gut. You cannot. These are ours. This woodland is ours. And again, collective action prevented it. And this might seem strange, but I don't think this should be underestimated. I mean, Live Aid, you can be very cynical about charity concerts today, I know, but it did change the world. And it showed what was possible. And it was the first event that had used the technology of satellites to actually focus on something positive, not some huge war. It focused a positive intent and a positive consciousness. And people said, the government's not doing enough about poverty and famine in Africa, we'll do it. And it's a little thing in the totality of history, but it did have a very long-term effect. I'm going to give you the famous quote from Gandhi because it still holds currency. Now, Gandhi, was he a perfect human being? No. Did he say some wise things? Yes. I think he did. And this is the classic, if you like. He said, when I despair, I remember that all through history, the ways of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they can seem invincible. But in the end, they always fall. Remember that. Always. So a lot of people feel at the moment that although it does seem that, there's a lot of trouble and strife, this is the shift in consciousness that many of the old prophecies spoke about. It's the beginning. Everything's up for grabs. It seems to be that, you don't just get instant enlightenment. You have to work for it. And yet when you do, that's when you get the new dawns. A lot of people think we're poised at a point we can choose. It can be heaven, it can be hell. If enough people focus positively on the issues and get up and do something about what they believe in, there will be shift. So if each one of us, we can't change the world on every level ourselves, but if each one of us just focuses some intent and action on whatever troubles you that you think you can make a difference of, it's going to set the dominoes going. Because sometimes people say, oh yes, but what can I do? And it's all so big. Well, you can do something. Even if you just talk to the people you know. It's uphill sometimes. Sometimes people laugh at you and say, oh, don't bore me with all this truth crap. But actually, very often, people in the end will start to respond and say, well, why do you believe that then? And then the door's open to conversation. You can say, because of this, that, and the other, and share your insights, your evidence. We can never hit people around the head with this. You cannot tell somebody to believe something, but you can offer an alternative truth and say, look, this is why I believe that this is the way the world is, and I believe we could change this. And often people respond, as I've found when I address these mainstream groups. Often people actually will come up and say, yeah, I know you're right, but I just didn't think you were supposed to say it. And that's the problem. People fear ridicule. If you don't fear ridicule and just stand in your power and do what you can do, whether it be campaigning about your local bus shelter or Scottish independence or fracking or whatever it is, make your voice heard if you really care. Tip the domino with consciousness. Don't let it be tipped for you, because there's plenty of people at the top who are trying to tip their own dominoes by manipulation and by lies and by control agendas. We can, as I've just shown, stand up against that. History shows we will win, whatever winning is, but we will make a difference if enough of us just stand up in our truth and in our power. So I hope that's just given you some food for thought, right? There's a tiny group of people here, one person standing here talking a load of old stuff, but maybe if there's just a seed of something here that you can take and run with somewhere, it will have served a purpose. If all of us do that, there will be positive change. I really do believe that. So thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.